Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Let's get straight into the true scary stories. Where shadows lead. For as long as I could remember, my shadow was just that, a dark outline clinging to my feet, always a few steps behind me. I never paid it much attention, just a natural part of life, like breathing. But recently, something changed. It wasn't gradual, it was abrupt, like a snap in the fabric of reality. I noticed it one evening while walking home from work. The setting sun cast long fingers of shadow across the ground, and I, out of habit, glanced at my own. But it wasn't where it should have been. Instead of trailing behind, my shadow stretched out ahead of me, as though it were impatient, leading the way. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. It was a cold evening, but the chill that ran through me had nothing to do with the temperature. I stared, unmoving, at the silhouette on the pavement. My shadow stood several feet in front, unnaturally long, as if it had detached itself from my body's movements. It didn't mirror me anymore. As I took a step back, it didn't follow. Instead, it crept forward, dragging itself, pulling me toward something. The logical part of my mind urged me to laugh it off. Shadows don't have wills of their own. But this felt wrong, viscerally wrong. There was a pulse in the air, a low thrum that seemed to resonate with the unnatural pull of the darkness ahead of me. I tried to shake off the feeling, quickening my pace as if I could outrun it. But no matter how fast I moved, it led. Not once did it retreat behind me. My steps slowed, as did my heartbeat, fear tightening its grip on my chest. I confided in Sarah the next morning. Sarah had always been the grounded one between us, my girlfriend and the rational voice to my constant overthinking. She sat across from me at breakfast, her eyebrows knitted as she listened. "You're exhausted," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Stress does weird things to the mind. You've been working too much." "I know it sounds crazy," I muttered, gripping my coffee mug as if it were a lifeline. "But I swear, Sarah, it's different. It feels alive. Like it's waiting for something." My voice dropped to a whisper. "Like it's hunting." Her eyes softened with concern, but she didn't push further. She did what she always did, offered me a soft smile and told me to rest. I nodded, but deep down, I knew that rest wasn't going to fix this. That night, as we lay in bed, I could feel its presence. My shadow, or whatever it had become, was watching. I don't know how to describe it, shadows don't have eyes, yet it felt as though this one did, and it was fixed on me. I woke up to darkness, a suffocating silence blanketing the room. I glanced at the clock, 3:13 a.m. The faint glow of the streetlight outside slanted through the blinds, casting lines of light and shadow across the floor. Sarah stirred beside me, her breathing steady. I exhaled slowly, telling myself I was imagining things. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. My shadow wasn't lying beside me in the bed like it should have been. It was standing, looming over me, its form distorted and taller than I could ever be. I froze. The shape on the wall was no longer mine. Its head cocked unnaturally to one side, the arms elongated in ways that defied anatomy. My mouth went dry. Slowly, I slid out of bed, careful not to disturb Sarah, my gaze never leaving the figure on the wall. It didn't move. I told myself it wouldn't move. But then it did. It began to walk, not towards me, but away, towards the door, as if beckoning me to follow. My feet betrayed me. Against all sense, I moved. The door creaked open, and my shadow, no longer mine, slipped through, disappearing into the hallway beyond. I took one last look at Sarah, who slept soundly, unaware of the horror unfolding, and followed. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stop, to wake her, to run. But I couldn't. My shadow led, and I was too scared to see where it was taking me. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. The hallway was unnervingly quiet as I stepped out, following the faint outline of my shadow, which now seemed to move with a deliberate slowness, as if it knew I would follow. The familiar walls of my home felt alien, distorted by the darkness that clung to every corner. I kept my gaze locked on the shadow, terrified that if I blinked, it would disappear, or worse, be waiting behind me when I opened my eyes again. I couldn't explain why I followed it. It wasn't curiosity, not even fear, exactly. It felt more like compulsion, like an invisible thread tied to my chest, tugging me forward. The floor beneath my feet seemed colder than usual, the air heavy with an almost oppressive weight. Each step echoed unnaturally loud, as if the house itself was amplifying my movements. My shadow never hurried, it didn't have to. I was bound to it now. Suddenly, it stopped at the basement door, a place I hadn't been in months. The door stood ajar, creaking slightly as it swayed in the draft that shouldn't have existed. My heart hammered in my chest as I stood there, unwilling to descend. The darkness beyond the door was thick, almost tangible, swallowing the weak light from the hallway. I didn't want to go down there. Everything in me screamed to turn back, to return to bed, to wake Sarah and tell her this nightmare was real. But my legs moved on their own, betraying my sanity. I stepped forward. As I descended the steps, the creak of each board beneath my weight seemed to reverberate deeper, as though the sound was being swallowed by the void below. The basement had always felt unsettling, but tonight it was something else entirely. The darkness here felt alive, like it was watching, waiting. My shadow stretched ahead of me, distorted by the dim light, its shape shifting in a way that made my skin crawl. It didn't feel like my reflection anymore. It felt like something separate, something wrong. At the bottom of the stairs, I hesitated. The basement was cluttered, just as I remembered it, boxes stacked in uneven piles, old furniture draped with sheets, and a single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The light flickered as I reached for the pull chain. A low hum filled the air, like a distant whisper, just on the edge of hearing. My shadow slid across the floor, stopping in the far corner of the room, where an old mirror leaned against the wall. I hadn't noticed it before, though it had been here when I moved in. A relic of the previous owner, left behind, gathering dust. The reflection in the mirror made my stomach drop. I saw myself, or what should have been me, but something was wrong. The figure standing in the mirror wore my face, but its eyes were hollow, deep black voids that seemed to stretch back forever. It smiled, but not with my mouth. The grin was wide, too wide, twisting my features into something grotesque, something inhuman. "Do you know where you're going?" the figure whispered, its voice rasping, though its lips never moved. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. It took a step forward. No, the reflection didn't move, the shadow behind me did. The black mass that had once clung to my feet now detached itself fully, rising to stand beside me, towering over me like some long-forgotten creature birthed from the deepest corners of nightmares. My chest tightened, and I turned, bolting for the stairs. The steps seemed endless as I scrambled up, my legs heavy as if wading through quicksand. Behind me, I heard it, the creak of something in pursuit. Not footsteps, but the dragging, scraping sound of something unnatural pulling itself closer. I dared not look back. My hand reached for the door, fingers trembling as I pushed it open, heart slamming against my ribs. The door swung shut behind me with a deafening bang, sealing the darkness below. I collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. My body was shaking, drenched in cold sweat. I listened, waiting for the sound of it following me. Nothing. Silence. But I didn't dare relax. My eyes darted to the ground, searching for my shadow, praying that it would be behind me like before. But it wasn't. It was gone. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice hoarse. I rushed back to the bedroom, desperate to find her. I needed her to tell me this was just some terrible dream, that none of this was real. I burst through the door, expecting her to sit up, startled by the noise, ready to ask what was wrong. But the bed was empty. Sarah was gone. The space beside me in the bed was cold, the sheets neatly pulled back as if she had never been there at all. My heart raced, the panic mounting in my chest. I searched the room frantically, calling her name under my breath, but only the hollow echo of my voice greeted me in return. The silence that followed was so dense, I swore I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand, the faint blue glow of the screen the only light in the room. I dialed Sarah's number, hoping she'd answer, hoping this was just some sick coincidence. It rang once, twice, then the call cut out. Not to voicemail, just silence. I stared at the phone, confused, and tried again. This time, nothing. Not even a ring. The screen flickered briefly before going black. Dead. I felt a coldness crawl up my spine, settling in the base of my skull like icy fingers digging into my flesh. I knew something was terribly wrong. Sarah wouldn't just leave like this. Not without a word. Not in the middle of the night. And definitely not after what I told her this morning about the shadow. My eyes drifted to the window, to the slats of light filtering through the blinds, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the darkness just beyond. Suddenly, a low thud echoed through the house, followed by a slow, deliberate creak. The sound came from downstairs. The basement. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, knowing I had no choice. I couldn't just stand there, paralyzed by fear, while Sarah was missing. Gathering what little courage I had left, I headed back down the hallway, each step a battle against the growing terror gnawing at the edges of my sanity. The basement door stood wide open, though I knew I had slammed it shut moments before. A dim light spilled out, flickering as if it was struggling to stay alive. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs, each creak beneath my feet amplifying the dread pooling in my gut. The cold was more intense now, a biting chill that stung my skin and made every breath feel labored. The basement felt different, darker, as if the very air was thicker, suffocating me as I moved deeper into its depths. When I reached the bottom, I froze. There, in the corner, stood Sarah. Her back was to me, her head tilted slightly as though she were listening to something I couldn't hear. I called her name, but she didn't respond, didn't even flinch. My hands trembled as I took a cautious step forward. "Sarah?" My voice cracked, weak against the oppressive silence. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge me in any way. But something else did. From the shadows behind her, the same grotesque shape of my shadow began to emerge. It stretched out, its form twisting unnaturally, limbs elongating, its mouth wide in that awful grin I had seen in the mirror. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just a shadow, it was something alive, something ancient and malevolent, and it was wrapped around her, claiming her. I could feel its presence, a heavy, suffocating force pressing against me. "Sarah!" I yelled, louder this time, my voice trembling. Slowly, she turned. Her face was pale, her eyes empty, as though whatever made her Sarah had been stripped away. A tear slipped down my cheek as I realized this wasn't her anymore. This thing had taken her. And then, she spoke. But it wasn't her voice. It was deeper, rougher, like something crawling up from the depths of the earth. "It's not Sarah you should be worried about," it whispered, lips curling into a mockery of a smile. "It's you. You've always been the one." I staggered back, my mind racing, unable to process what I was seeing. The thing that used to be my shadow slid forward, its elongated arms reaching toward me, its face twisting into a horrific parody of my own features. "You thought you could outrun me," it hissed, the sound like nails scraping against stone. "But you were always mine. From the very first time you looked away, I was there. Waiting." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen, caught in the grip of its awful gaze. It stepped closer, and I could feel the air around me grow colder, sharper, as though the very life was being drained from the room. My shadow wasn't mine anymore. It had never been. It was something else entirely, something far worse. And now it was coming for me. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling as the shadow creature advanced. The air around me grew colder, each breath turning to frost as it left my lips. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice echoing unnaturally in the confined space. The thing wearing Sarah's face twisted her features into a grotesque smile. "It's not about what I want," it hissed. "It's about what you've already given." Its eyes, black voids, bore into mine, filling me with a sense of dread I couldn't shake. Desperation clawed at my insides. "I haven't given you anything," I protested, edging away as the shadows around us deepened, the walls seeming to close in. My gaze darted around, seeking any possible escape, but the basement had become an abyss. The doorway vanished. "Oh, but you have," the creature purred, its form shifting, flickering between Sarah's visage and my own distorted reflection. "Every fear, every doubt, every moment of despair, you've been feeding me all along." A memory flashed through my mind, nights spent alone, enveloped in darkness, letting anxieties consume me. Had I unwittingly invited this entity into my life? "I can change," I whispered, more to myself than to it. "I can fight you." It laughed, a sound like shattering glass. "You cannot fight what is a part of you," it said, extending a shadowy hand toward me. "Embrace the inevitable." Summoning every ounce of willpower, I closed my eyes and concentrated on the warmth of Sarah's smile, the brightness of the sun, the simple joys I'd neglected. "You are nothing without me," I declared, opening my eyes to meet its gaze. "And I am stronger than you think." The creature recoiled slightly, its form flickering. "Bold words," it sneered. "But words are wind." I took a step forward. "Maybe," I admitted. "But they're my wind." I reached out, and as my hand met the shadow's substance, a shock ran through me. For a moment, we were one, a collision of light and dark, hope and despair. A blinding flash erupted, and the entity shrieked, a sound that rattled the very foundations of the house. The darkness peeled away, layers of shadow dissolving like mist under the morning sun. I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, the oppressive air thinning as the creature faded into nothingness. Breathing heavily, I found myself alone in the basement, the familiar clutter bathed in the soft glow of the single bulb. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with disbelief. Had it truly ended? "Sarah!" I called, my voice hoarse. I raced up the stairs, each step feeling lighter than the last. Bursting into the kitchen, I saw her standing by the window, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. She turned, eyebrows raised in surprise. "You're up early," she remarked, a gentle smile playing on her lips. "Everything okay?" I nodded, tears prickling at the corners of my eyes. I had the strangest nightmare." Her expression softened. "Want to talk about it?" "Maybe later," I said, crossing the room to pull her into a tight embrace. The warmth of her body against mine was reassuring, anchoring me to reality. "I'm just glad you're here." "Where else would I be?" she chuckled, pulling back to look at me. But as our eyes met, a shadow flickered across her gaze, brief but unmistakable. A chill ran down my spine. "Sarah?" I whispered, uncertainty creeping back in. Her smile widened ever so slightly. "Yes," she replied, her tone innocent yet somehow off. I stepped back, a sinking feeling settling in my stomach. The room seemed to dim around us. "Is everything all right?" I asked cautiously. She tilted her head, eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that froze my blood. "Of course," she said softly. "Why wouldn't it be?" But there it was again, a darkness lurking just beneath the surface. I realized then that my battle wasn't over. The shadow hadn't been destroyed, it had merely found a new host. The true horror dawned on me: you can confront your own darkness, but can you face it in the ones you love? Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The Scratching. The first time I heard the scratching, I dismissed it as rats. My old house, inherited from my grandparents, was a creaky, aging relic, prone to all manner of strange noises. The walls groaned at night, the floorboards shifted beneath unseen weight, and the attic was a place I avoided. Dust, cobwebs, and forgotten memories filled its corners. But the scratching was new. It started low, barely audible, like something tiny moving through the walls. At first, it came at night, a gentle scraping that blended with the sound of wind outside. But soon, it became more frequent. One evening, as I sat reading in the living room, I heard it again, closer this time, directly behind the wall where the family photos hung. The sound was rhythmic, like nails dragging through plaster. I stood up and ran my hand across the wallpaper, half expecting it to ripple beneath my touch. Nothing. A chill crept down my spine, but I tried to laugh it off. Rats. It had to be rats. I'd call an exterminator in the morning. Days passed, and the noise grew more insistent. Every night, just as I was about to drift off, the scratching began anew. I imagined their tiny claws tearing through insulation, gnawing at beams. Still, I hesitated to investigate. There was something unsettling about the sound. It wasn't just the noise itself, but the way it seemed to follow me. Wherever I moved in the house, the scratching would start soon after. Almost as if it was watching, waiting. Then came the night the scratching stopped. I had been lying in bed, waiting for the inevitable noise, but there was only silence. The kind of silence that feels heavier than sound. A suffocating quiet that presses against your chest. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was over, that the rats had moved on. But something nagged at me, pulling me from the comfort of my bed. I found myself walking to the attic, flashlight in hand, though I couldn't explain why. The air grew colder the closer I got, the wooden steps groaning beneath my weight. At the top, I hesitated, staring at the door. It had always been locked, ever since I inherited the house. My grandparents had warned me never to go up there. They'd always been cryptic about the attic, like it held a secret they were too afraid to share. The key hung on the kitchen wall, a rusted relic that no longer seemed to fit with the house. But I had never used it, until tonight. The lock clicked, and the door swung open with a creak that echoed through the stillness. Inside, the air was thick with dust, particles floating lazily in the beam of my flashlight. Boxes, old furniture, and forgotten heirlooms littered the space. It smelled of decay and neglect. I stepped inside, and the floorboards groaned beneath me. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. But then, I saw it. A small, tattered leather book lay on a table in the corner, partially hidden beneath a moth-eaten blanket. Something about it drew me closer. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. It was an old photo album. I recognized it immediately. It had belonged to my family for generations. As I flipped through the pages, the familiar faces of my ancestors stared back at me, captured in fading black and white photographs. But then, as I turned the page to a photo of myself as a child, my heart stopped. There, etched into the paper, were deep claw marks, tearing through my image, as though something had tried to rip me from existence. I stared at the claw marks slashing across my childhood photo, disbelief gnawing at the edges of my mind. My hands trembled as I ran a finger over the jagged tears. The paper was cold, almost unnaturally so, and I could feel the texture where the photograph had been gouged. My breath hitched. The scratch marks weren't random. They were deliberate, as though something, or someone, had specifically targeted me. I flipped the page, my heartbeat quickening as I scanned the next photo, another image of me, this time around the age of 10. The same claw marks marred the picture, ripping through my face. I hurried through the album, dread building in my chest with every turn of the page. Every photo of me, whether I was smiling at a family picnic, posing for school pictures, or blowing out birthday candles, was defaced by the same vicious scratches. I slammed the book shut, the echo of its closing reverberating through the attic. My mind raced, but I couldn't make sense of it. It had to be a cruel joke, some twisted prank my subconscious was playing on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The claw marks felt too real. Too deliberate. It was as if something wanted to erase me, to pull me out of my own past. A sudden noise behind me made me jump. A soft, dragging sound, like claws scratching against wood. My blood ran cold. I spun around, my flashlight casting shaky beams of light across the attic. There was nothing, just shadows shifting in the corners, the faint outline of old furniture barely visible. But the sound was there. Growing louder. Closer. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. I swallowed hard, taking a step toward the door, But the scratching started again, this time, from beneath me. It was coming from under the floorboards. My flashlight flickered, casting long, wavering shadows along the walls. I knelt down, pressing my ear to the cold wood. The scratching was frantic now, almost as if whatever was beneath me was trying to claw its way out. For the first time, I wondered if it was truly rats. I felt the wood shift under my palm, as though something moved beneath the floor. I staggered back, heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't normal. I needed to leave. Now. But as I turned to rush down the stairs, I tripped over the leg of an old chair, sending me sprawling to the floor. My flashlight skidded across the room, leaving me in near darkness. Scrambling to my feet, I grabbed the flashlight, its beam shaking as I swung it around, searching the attic. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a small hatch in the corner of the room, half hidden beneath a stack of old crates. It was covered in dust, the wood rotted and splintered, but it looked like it hadn't been opened in years. My heart raced as I moved toward it, drawn by a force I couldn't explain. Without thinking, I reached out and pulled the hatch open. A gust of cold air hit me in the face, and the stench of decay filled my lungs. Beneath the hatch was a crawlspace, dark and narrow, stretching into the shadows beneath the house. And then, in the dim light of the flashlight, I saw it, a pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, staring back at me. I froze, my mind screaming for me to run, but my body refused to move. The eyes didn't blink. They just watched, unblinking, filled with something ancient. I took a step back, but before I could move further, a low, guttural growl rumbled from the darkness. The scratching had stopped. Whatever was down there had found me. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hand and rolling across the floor. The beam spun wildly, casting fleeting shapes of the attic's forgotten relics, but it didn't reach the crawlspace. It was swallowed by darkness. The glow of the eyes remained, unblinking, now accompanied by a slow, deep rasp, like the sound of breath through a throat too long forgotten. I could barely catch my own breath, my chest heaving with the panic that clawed its way up my throat. My mind screamed at me to move, but my legs felt rooted to the floor, anchored by a terror I hadn't known I was capable of feeling. The growling grew louder, as if the thing beneath the house was testing the air, tasting it, tasting me. Then it moved. The eyes shifted, rising just a little, and I heard the faint sound of something scraping against the wood. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I finally managed to break free of my paralysis and bolted toward the stairs. I didn't look back. My feet thundered down the steps, and the attic door slammed behind me, sealing whatever horror lurked beneath those floorboards inside. I leaned against the door, chest heaving, my pulse hammering in my ears. I had to think. I had to understand what was happening. It couldn't be real. It couldn't. But the claw marks in the photos, the noise under the house, the eyes, they were all too real to deny. Something was in this house with me. Something that had been watching me for longer than I cared to imagine. Downstairs, the scratching resumed, louder and more insistent, like nails dragging across the very foundation of the house. It was everywhere now, surrounding me, echoing through the walls. Whatever lived beneath this house, it wasn't content to stay hidden anymore. I needed answers. There had to be something in the family history, some clue I hadn't seen before. My grandparents had warned me about the attic, about the house itself. Maybe they knew something. Maybe that's why they had been so careful to keep the attic locked. I made my way to the study, where my grandfather's old journals lined the shelves. He had always been an obsessive man, documenting everything about the house and our family's strange history. As a child, I'd never paid much attention to his ramblings. But now, with the scratching and the memory of those eyes burned into my mind, I knew there had to be something here, something to explain what I'd seen. I flipped through the pages, skimming his handwriting until something caught my eye. A single entry, dated just weeks before his death. There is something wrong with the house. I've heard the scratching again. It's getting louder. The album, what did I unleash by hiding it there? I thought locking it away would stop it, but it's been watching. Waiting. There's no stopping it now. It's hungry, and it knows. It always knows who to find next. I felt the blood drain from my face as I read the words. My grandfather had heard the same scratching. He had hidden the album away, locked it in the attic, thinking it would contain whatever horror it was linked to. But it hadn't. It was still here, and it had been waiting for me. Suddenly, the floorboards beneath my feet groaned. The scratching turned into a furious raking sound, as if whatever was beneath me was tearing its way through the very foundation of the house. The growl returned, low and angry. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the walls were closing in. I backed away from the study door just as the floor trembled beneath me, the wood splintering with a sickening crack. And then, rising from the jagged hole in the floor, I saw it, a hand, clawed and gnarled, covered in skin that looked too old to belong to anything human. It reached toward me, and as it did, the growl transformed into something worse, something that sounded like my own name being spoken in a voice that should not exist. I stood frozen, watching that twisted hand reach up from the broken floor. The voice, if it could be called that, continued to rasp my name, each syllable dragged out like it was tasting it, savoring it. I backed away, my legs trembling, but my eyes remained fixed on the thing rising from the darkness beneath the house. More of its form emerged, a figure half shadow and half decayed flesh, pulling itself up from the depths like something out of a nightmare. I scrambled toward the door, but the floor buckled beneath me, another crack splitting the wood as more of the house gave way. Dust and plaster rained down from the ceiling as the walls groaned, like the house itself was fighting to keep this thing inside. But it was too late. It had already begun to escape. The creature's face finally emerged from the hole, a skeletal visage with skin stretched too tight across its bones. Its eyes were hollow, glowing faintly with the same eerie light I had seen in the crawlspace. It smiled, a grotesque, lipless grin, its teeth jagged and broken. And then it spoke again, this time more clearly, more human. "You were always meant to come back." I staggered back, my heart pounding in my chest. "What are you?" My voice cracked with fear, barely audible over the creaking of the house. The thing cocked its head, its smile widening. "You belong to me. You always have. Your family tried to keep me hidden, but blood is the tie that binds. You can't escape it." My mind raced, my grandfather's journal flashing through my thoughts. The scratching, the album, the attic, it was all connected to this thing, this monster. My family had known about it, tried to seal it away, but they had failed. And now it had found me. "I don't belong to you," I managed to say, though the words felt weak, hollow. The creature's smile faltered for a moment, and then it laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers through my bones. "Oh, but you do. The marks on your photos, those were just the beginning. I've been watching you. Waiting for the right time." I remembered the claw marks on my photos, each one a violent attempt to tear me from existence. They weren't just marks of anger, they were marks of ownership. This thing had claimed me long before I'd ever set foot in this house. I could feel it now, the weight of its presence pressing down on me, suffocating. Suddenly, the walls began to tremble, and the air grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that I could see my breath in the dim light. The house seemed to be collapsing in on itself, as if it couldn't contain the creature any longer. Cracks snaked up the walls, and the ceiling sagged, groaning under an unseen weight. I had to get out. Now. I turned and bolted for the front door, but the floor split open in front of me, jagged planks jutting up to block my path. Behind me, the creature let out a low growl, and I could hear it moving, dragging its twisted body across the floor toward me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I searched for another way out, but the house was crumbling around me, the walls closing in, trapping me inside. "You can't run," the voice whispered, echoing from every corner of the room. "You've been mine since the moment you were born." Desperation clawed at my chest, but then I saw it, the album, lying on the floor where I had dropped it. It was open, the pages fluttering wildly as the air in the room grew heavier. My eyes locked onto the photo of myself as a child, the deep claw marks slashing through my face. Something about it pulled me in, an instinct, a connection I couldn't explain. Without thinking, I lunged for the album, my fingers gripping its fragile spine. The moment I touched it, the house seemed to shudder, and the creature hissed in fury, its claws scraping across the floor as it closed in on me. I had no plan, no idea what to do, but I knew the album was the key. I tore the photo of myself from the page, the paper ripping under my fingers. The creature screamed, a horrible, piercing sound that rattled through my skull. The room began to twist, reality warping around me as the walls bent and the floor buckled beneath my feet. The air grew thicker, suffocating, as if the house itself was trying to swallow me whole. But I didn't stop. I tore at the photos, ripping every image of myself from the album. Each time I did, the creature howled in agony, its form flickering, growing weaker. I could see it now, its twisted body starting to dissolve, its skeletal grin fading as the claw marks on the photos vanished one by one. "You can't escape me," it roared, but its voice was growing fainter, distorted. With one final scream, the creature collapsed into a cloud of ash, its form scattering into the air like dust. The house trembled one last time, and then, silence. The scratching stopped. The walls stilled. The air cleared. I stood there, clutching the torn photos in my hand, the album lying in tatters at my feet. It was over. Whatever had been watching me, haunting me, was gone. The house was still, but I knew the scars it left behind would never fade. Yet, as I looked down at the ruined album, a strange sense of unease crept over me. I flipped through the remaining pages, searching. And there, on the very last page, was a new photo, a photo of me, standing in the attic, holding the album. It was fresh. And beneath it, new claw marks. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.